Hi folks, I'm Brendan Burns and I'm joined today by Timothy Beardson. He is the author of Stumbling Giant, The Threats to China's Future. Thank you so much for your time.
Pleased to be here.
Great. So I wanted to start with a quote you had in the book, which is, without significant reform, China is unlikely to replace America as the next superpower. Could you kind of expand on that and the reasoning behind that?
Right. Well, China has a lot of major problems in front of it. Most of those problems are soluble. One of the biggest problems is demography, and that's very hard to fix. But even if we live with China's demographic problems, if it could deal with all the others, then China could potentially continue to show growth, but at a lower level than we're used to seeing. My concern is that there's not enough sign yet of the vigor and courage to reform that China needs to show.
Let's dig more into demographics. I know back in the 80s, a lot of people were saying that Japan was the next superpower also, but they got crushed on demographics as well. I think I saw a stat where it said by 2020, there'll be more adult diapers sold in Japan than baby diapers. Could you talk about what demographics does to a country like China and why that's such an inhibiting factor in their growth?
Right. Well, for me, China's demographic problem comes in 4 different phases. The first one is China's labor force is starting to reduce in size because the number of births was falling the last 40 years. That's now coming through to workforce. And the Chinese workforce, therefore, is seeing its wages rise by double digits every year. It's ceasing to be a cheap place to make manufactured goods. Now, China has to find a new economic model. It's becoming uncompetitive. It's got to try and develop an innovative approach to the economy. And that transition is not being proved to be easy. The second challenge is that China is an aging society. We're going to go from 100 million people over 65 today to, by 2030, about 300 million over 65. But compounding that problem, the Chinese family is getting smaller in relationship to the number of retired people. Now a typical couple might have 4 parents alive and 8 grandparents alive, but no siblings. And that puts the real pressure on that they're not going to do what Chinese families traditionally did, which is to look after the old people at home. Now it's increasingly going to be a problem for the state. And at the moment, 1% of old people are in institutional care. I think by 2030 that could be 50%.
Wow.
You could be going from 1 million to 150 million in 20 years. And China is a country with a big economy but a small budget. So I can see agonizing fiscal choices to be made by the Chinese government. Do we build care homes for 150 million people, or do we build 6 more aircraft carriers?
Right.
The third challenge is gender disparity. China for the last 20 years has had more boys than girls, 6 to 5. And that's because if people are going to have fewer children, they tend, in a rural Confucian society, to want to have boys. And what that means is we now have the most pronounced gender disparity of any country in the world, and probably of any society in history. And we can forecast that over the next 20 years, there are going to be something like 50 million men who will not have a wife. And those men are going to be the poorer, the less intelligent people in society. And they're going to be heading for the cities, and already that's beginning to show up in urban crime statistics, and I think later that will start to affect social stability. But the fourth problem is probably the biggest. The fourth problem for China is that the overall population is glacially increasing, and every forecast is that it'll peak by the late 2020s at around about 1.4 billion people. At that point it'll start to go down. The total population will fall from then to the end of the century. There are many different forecasts. The most cautious is that it will fall by 1/3. More robust forecasts are that it could fall by anywhere up to 2/3. And I think the big take from this is that no society that I know in history has had steep falls in population for decades and yet has been able to sustain high rates of economic growth. I think by the 2030s we're going to be saying if China has had a good year, if it's achieved maybe 2% growth. So what we've got to do is manage expectations and the economy from here to there.